Hello, my name is Laurel Ruma, and I'm with O'Reilly Media. Today we're talking with Eric McNulty, who is affiliated with Harvard University's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where he is an instructor and a director of research at the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Laurel. Glad to be here.
Great. Actually, let's start off with a question that seems like a softball, but it's actually pretty complicated, which is, what is the difference between leadership and management?
That is a really interesting question, and I think it is one that I see them as very complementary skill sets. In that anyone who knows is a really good manager knows a fair bit about leadership, and effective leaders actually know a fair bit about management. And a lot of the division between the two doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They're on a continuum, and so what I like to think of them, the difference is leadership is about the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we together? Why is this work important? Management is the what. So how are we going to do it? How are we going to manage success? What are the deadlines? What's the process? And so if you're managing a team and they know all the what, but they aren't clear on the why, there won't be a lot of engagement. They won't be able to see the bigger picture, and they won't notice when things are going off track. Conversely, if they understand the why, but they don't really understand how you're trying to do it, again, there can be a lot of energy, but not a lot of productivity. So it is on a continuum, and it is getting both why and the what right. So why is the leadership? What is the management?
And what is your background in management? How did you come to this position?
That's a long and winding road, as they say. So I spent many years as an operating manager. So I managed 80 unionized retail salespeople in New York and at Bloomingdale's, their flagship store when I first got out of college. And then I ran marketing groups. I was a creative director as well as having management roles in communications. So I ran teams of internal service units. I've run business units. And so managing the P&L, hiring, firing, developing, all of that. That was about the first 20 years or so of my career. I then did a bit of startup work as part of that toward the end and ran my own business for a while. My initial 12 years here at Harvard were, again, in operating roles where I was at first creative director and running an internal service unit, and then kind of a conference business where I was managing a business unit, managing a P&L, building a team, and getting them to execute. So my current role in academia, where I'm teaching and researching, is actually relatively new. But I bring all that experience, having been in a variety of settings, to having worked for good bosses, terrible bosses, hopefully having been a pretty good boss myself. And though my focus now is on leadership, I absolutely understand the critical role that management plays in overall effectiveness of a team or an organization.
What kind of research do you do into management or leadership?
So a couple of areas these days. One is I look very much at organizational culture and how to, as I put it, bring humanity back to our organizations, having the workplace be somewhere where you want to show up, where you bring both all your head, hands, and heart, and get some satisfaction and not just come in and crank out the hours and pick up the check. I look at quite a bit these days at applied neuroscience of how the brain is hardwired and how we work together, how humans as a social species, how we interact. And look quite a bit at what we call collaborative leadership, or how do you lead in non-hierarchical situations, which is, I do a lot of work in disaster preparedness and response, but I think it's actually analogous to a lot of what happens in the tech world. And I've increasingly begun to think about leadership more as an open source process than as I'm well beyond thinking about leadership as a role or a rank. It's a set of behaviors. And as I say, I now see it as a process where many people can engage in many different roles. You're moving the team or the organization forward toward your desired outcome.
That's really interesting. Let me just step back 2 thoughts here. Is collaborative leadership sort of a progression from servant leadership?
Yes and no. It's amazing. Again, on the academic side, there are separate bodies of research on collaborative leadership, collectivistic leadership. So there's lots of hair splitting in terms of, is it peers working together? Is it consensus-based leadership? I see servant leadership as primarily a philosophy, and it's actually one that I embrace, in that your role as a leader is to invest in people, to develop people. It is your responsibility and your privilege to be in that role, not the privilege of people to serve you. And so I think that Greenleaf's work on servant leadership, I think, is still really instructive. But the collective leadership, the collaborative leadership, is looking at, it's really useful in sort of cross-silo situations of how do you get sales and marketing and DevOps and production, all the different pieces of the organization working together when there may be no clear hierarchy, or if there is one and people resent it and saying, well, I'm as important as that person. How do you work together as an executive team or a leadership team? This is research that my colleagues and I did after the Boston Marathon bombings, where when you went back and looked at it, actually was no one in charge of the overall operation, but it went really well. And that was possible because the leaders of the various silos of the Boston police, the state police, and each of the pieces, they were leading in their traditional way within their organizations. They had a chain of command and all that. But together, they had a high degree of trust. They saw a joint mission. They saw their success or failure as being tied to each other. So no one tried to jump out front, take all the credit or apportion blame. And they saw themselves as they each had credibility doing their jobs, so staying in their lane. And so part of what their job was to help others succeed in their lanes. There wasn't mission creep, which often happens where, marketing will say, well, sales has no clue what they're doing. We'll have to compensate for that. In this case, there was none of that. So it's really about these principles of, is there a shared mission with shared values? Are you credible in your lane? Can you help others in their lanes? Are people being generous in spirit and action? So working well together. Can you keep egos and blame under control? And that all rests on a basis of trust-based relationships. The people know each other and trust each other so that they feel comfortable being part of that team. Where there's, any leadership role, whether it's a crisis like a bombing or putting out a major new product release, it's a fairly risky environment. So you've got to trust the people around you, because if it doesn't go well, someone's going to take the hit. And usually it goes best, at least in our experience, when people go into it with the attitude that if it goes well, we're all going to get credit. And if it goes wrong, we all own a piece of the blame. So people are on the same page and moving forward together.
And sort of that set of behaviors, I can see how it translates a bit to the open source world, where you are sort of performing functions as needed to the project. But of course, you're always maybe looking for more people. But I think that kind of thought of contributing to a goal and a shared mission and values is very much like a tenet of the open source world and process. And also just the thought of collaboration as well as evolution. So it's not a static one way of doing something. You're stepping back and thinking about how it can be done better each time you go through it.
That's right. And also, I think the other analogy to the open source world is that, I talked about that process, that if there's a piece of the project that's happening where you have the greatest expertise, I should be prepared to defer to you and let you lead that. We get to another part of the project where perhaps my expertise is more relevant and I've got more of it. You begin to defer to me. And there's no loss of status in that. It's the appropriate person leading at the appropriate time. And that's tough in static hierarchical organizations, because people see stepping out of that perceived leader role as a demotion, where actually, if you can see it as the right person in the right place at the right time, it becomes more fluid. And that handing the baton off now doesn't mean you're never going to get it back.
Right. Interesting. How has that really changed, like being a manager and being a leader in the last 20 years or so? I mean, like we think of management theory and Drucker and, all the thinkers, but, now we're sort of faced with different challenges, or management and people have always had challenges, and it's just different to us because it's new.
Right. And I do say to people, if you want to learn about management, go back and read Drucker. If you want to learn about leadership, go back and read Warren Bennis. Although that work is not new and they both passed away at this point, it's still highly relevant and really insightful. But I think the main places where things have evolved and certainly changed, one is that we are clearly, and particularly in the tech world, in more fluid, flatter, more collaborative work arrangements, much more team-based. And so it's not the old industrial age production line where you had the manager who just said, I'm the boss, do it my way, shut up, I'm in charge. It's much more collaborative now, and you're not just trying to get people to put widgets in place, but you actually need to engage their thinking and their ideas and their enthusiasm. And your goal is how much positive energy can you get people to put on the table? Because when you come to work, you can occupy the chair and you can do enough to get by and collect the check, or you can come in and offer your best and try hard and make things better over time and be a real good, a significant player on the team. The difference between those two things is often the manager and how does that person approach it. And so, again, if they see their role as setting a standard, it's much more done by influence these days of I will invest in you and help you learn how to do the best job you can do. I will recognize when you're doing things well. I will have a high tolerance for low consequence mistakes and help you learn from those. And also being open, this is one of the harder things I think to do, is to know when you have to enforce strict procedure and when you can allow improvisation. So there are certain things where you want really clean code, or you've got to hit a certain deadline, or there are certain requirements of an operating system where you have to do things a certain way, and you need to enforce that and make that very clear. Other times, as long as someone gets to at least to the level of performance you want or the outcome you want, if they can get there a different way, you have to be able to accept that that's okay. I learned that this many years ago when I was a creative director, and we would go to watch one of our jobs be printed. Back when things actually showed up on paper rather than just being on a screen. You actually would go to the printers and you would stand there next to the press and they would pull off press sheets and you would look and see, is the color right? Are things aligned? Is the job at the quality level you want it to be? And some people wanted to go in with a standard checklist and a set of standard operating procedures, and that's exactly how they would do it, highly structured. Other people would go in and they'd have a different way of going about how they would check things and what they would use as their process for getting to the right thing. What I had to learn and come to appreciate is that both ways are okay as long as what wound up at the end was the level of quality we wanted. And, so there was deviation in how you got there was okay. So knowing when you can't deviate from the process and when you should allow some deviation is something you learn over time as a manager. And it helps people invest more in themselves when you can let them learn how they do it best. So that's really important. I think the other thing which is important is that we started off with the difference between leadership and management. I think we actually devalued management a bit undeservedly. And this probably goes back maybe 25 years, not 20. But when the whole re-engineering movement came along and whole swaths of middle management got taken out of organizations, you became very vulnerable if you were just a manager. But if you were a leader, well, then you were special and important and your job was more secure. So suddenly everybody wanted to be a leader. And both are important, as I said earlier. And research will show that more managed organizations will outperform those that are poorly managed every single time. Not just those that are led well, but those that actually are, they worry about process and deadline and customer satisfaction. And are they hiring the right people and developing them appropriately and promoting them? And all that sort of nuts and bolts stuff is really important to overall performance.
That's really interesting. So the skills that managers would have to know today is that a bit of the evolution from understanding process and why it works when it works, as well as creating a learning culture. So your people learn as well as, you do as well. And then also kind of knowing when to maybe exert influence, like when is it appropriate for a manager to step up? And is it okay sometimes to let people just figure out situations for themselves?
Right. I see now, a manager's job is to create a high-performing team. And that doesn't mean you have to be the best at everyone's job works for you, which some managers assume. And that means you don't hire people who are smarter than you, which is a bad thing. It means you do have to be very attuned to the dynamics of the team, what are the relationships between the people, and have you built the process in a way that allows everyone to contribute to the fullest extent of their ability as often as possible. But it is that focus on, your job is not to make yourself the star. Your job is to make sure the team performs really well. One of my examples here, pardon my hometown enthusiasm, but when the Red Sox in 2004 won the World Series for the first time in 86 years, there were not a lot of superstars in that team. But they had fun together. They gelled really well. They supported each other. They were a high-performing team, even though, except for a couple of names, those folks were not going to the Hall of Fame. And, not much later, when the Red Sox put together what looked like on paper the greatest team ever built, they wound up in last place. So it's being very attentive to what's the dynamic on this team, what's the vibe, and are people working well together to get to that common shared objective.
How do you do that? How do you help managers, A, understand they need that kind of help, and B, maybe get that training, coaching? There's no magic bullet, that's for sure. So what is the path to becoming a good manager as you see it?
Part of it is knowing that it does take some time and it does take some experience. No one's perfect at it right out of the box. So being open with yourself and being empathetic to yourself, that you're going to get some things wrong, but you're going to try this. I think one of the first things to do is to not overly depend on your authority. So now you're the manager and you think, okay, now I've got a bigger desk or whatever, and I'm in charge. That's great. There are times you may need to exercise that authority to get something done or to remove somebody or restructure things. But learning, asking a lot of questions of people. So, Laurel, if you're coming from the outside in particular, how long have you been here? What's your background? What do you do now? What excites you about what you do now? So getting to know your people in that way. And then again, setting the expectation that you're not there with all the answers. You're there to help facilitate a high-performing team. So that may mean asking a lot of questions. That may mean asking even stupid questions. So why do we do it this way? Explain it to me. And there's a great book on this called "Turn This Ship Around" by a guy named David Marquet. And he was a captain in the Navy, and he's the nuclear submarine service. And when he was going to be given his first command, he was assigned one submarine. He had a long period. He knew the design of the ship. He knew all the personnel records of all the people. He knew everything inside and out. And 3 weeks before he was going to take command, the admiral called him in and said, "I'm sorry, we're not going to give you that submarine. We're going to give you this submarine over here," which was the worst performing submarine in the fleet for every metric. And he said, "Okay, so now I had to go in. I didn't know the ship and how it worked. I didn't know the people. I have 3 weeks. I'm going in relatively cold." And he said the gift in that was he began to go around and ask stupid questions. So what does that do? What's going on over here? And getting people, he had to learn the ship along with people, but it taught him a lot. He really got to know people by having conversations with them. So I think that's really important. Not over-asserting your authority, not backing down from what you need to, but authority is something to be used judiciously, because you're much better off if you can get people to do something because they want to do it, they understand why they're doing it, and that they understand the contribution they're making by doing it, so they derive some satisfaction as well. And that just takes some walking around, being visible, sitting down with people. And as I say, I've seen CEOs go into organizations and say, "I don't have all the answers, but I think there's some really talented people here who can help us figure it out, and we're going to get the job done." So if you can go in as a CEO and be that open, you should be able to go in as a first-time manager as well and acknowledge that you're learning as you go along too.
That's excellent. You mentioned neuroscience as one of those fields that you're looking at sort of in this new emerging trend people are talking about. It's not really emerging, but, people are talking about more and more the practice of management. What else are you kind of seeing that people are talking about, or perhaps talk more about that neuroscience angle?
Well, in neuroscience, a couple of things. One is understanding the role of emotions to us. As humans, we are emotional beings. And people, particularly new managers, that can make them feel very uncomfortable. It's like, "Oh no, I don't want to hug anybody. We're not going to cry, are we?" But it's not emotions that way. It's just that unless we engage with someone emotionally, we're not very open to hearing their rational arguments or their data. And so being liked, and that doesn't mean, I don't mean that in being everyone's best friend. When you like working for someone, when they are consistent, when they are open to questions, when they are open to feedback, when they provide direct feedback, when they are clear about their expectations. So it's creating an environment, and this is not technically neuroscience, but there's a lot of blending in what goes on in the brain between psychology and neuroscience, but what's known as psychological safety. So Amy Edmondson over at Harvard Business School has done a lot of research on this. And one of the things she found out was that medical teams that she studied, when they were able to discuss their mistakes openly, they made fewer mistakes. Interesting. That's one piece of data. David Rock, he is a neuroscientist, has looked at what's called social safety and found that when we've experienced social pain, so bullying, being excluded, being picked on, being yelled at, the brain processes that in a very similar way to physical pain, like getting punched in the face. So again, if you can create an environment of social safety where you can be tough on ideas, you can be tough on process, but try and be easy on people to the extent that you can. So that's a piece there. And one other piece, which goes back to more psychology, but it goes back to your servant leadership question, a really interesting study done about a year and a half ago at a tech company up in Canada where servant leadership was employed. They found that the use of servant leadership could be tied to increases in task performance, people did their jobs better, mission focus, so they understood the larger goal, and working well together, working well in teams. And what they pulled back and what they took away from that was that we have some core psychological drivers that we try and satisfy at work. One of them is competence. We like to get better at what we do over time. So if you can, when you're a servant leader or a servant manager, when you invest in people, when you help them learn, you help increase their competence. That increases their overall satisfaction at work. Another one is autonomy. Well, the better you are at what you do, the more autonomy you can give people to make decisions, to carry out work on their own, not be micromanaged. Everyone hates a micromanager. So again, if you're investing in people and you're teaching them, they're learning, they will grow in the autonomy you can give them over time. And third was something called relatedness, which is basically wanting to be part of a group. We humans are social beings. We're social animals. We feel most comfortable in a group. And so again, a servant leader or a servant manager who's creating an environment where people are appreciated, you're looking at everybody's individual worth and what they can contribute, you're helping them develop that builds a very friendly team environment. So those three things will, that approach will result in those outcomes because it contributes to feeling of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So again, the psychology and the neuroscience are getting all the different disciplines academically. In the application, they're getting very much integrated.
Yeah, that makes me think of Daniel Pink, right? Autonomy,
Yes.
mastery. Yep. So how do new managers, specifically, they need to ask a lot of questions. They know they don't know all the answers to everything, and they try to foster this collaborative and competent, but also safe setting for people to do the best jobs they can, but also be tough on problems, not on people. That kind of awareness seems like a tough thing to learn. So reading lots of good material. So we talked about Daniel Pink, Turn the Ship Around, as well as Drucker and Brennis. What other things would you subscribe people think about or read or study that maybe also then tangential to just the art of management itself?
Well, a couple of things. One is actually reading all those things you just mentioned is very good. I would also start keeping a journal if you don't already. And I would do it with old-fashioned pencil or pen on paper because your brain records things differently when you have to slow down to make the letters as opposed to typing them on a keyboard. And ask yourself some questions. And it doesn't take, you don't take hours doing this, but you can take 10 or 15 minutes at the end of a day and say, so when did I feel strongest today? When did I feel weakest? Or what interaction do I feel like I handled particularly well today? Which one did I feel could have gone a lot better? And just capturing those notes for yourself, reflecting in that way, helps you gain self-understanding and self-awareness. And this is something that does go back to Drucker. I mean, he was very much a fan of reflection. It's become popular again now with the advent of mindfulness and a lot of other practices at work. But taking time to reflect and think through again. So what went well and what didn't go so well? And if it didn't go well, what would you do differently? Capture that knowledge for yourself. And if that's only for you, you don't have to share it with anyone, but you'll become more aware. And I think if you see that being a manager is a role, and like a role on stage, you need to learn how to play it. So you need to both understand what's happening with you. What do you bring to the role? What's distinctive about you in this role? Why do they pick you to do this? And then secondly, what's the audience looking for? The audience are the people who work for you, your boss and your peers. And so there's this three sets of expectations you have to try and bring into balance somehow, which is your expectations for yourself, the expectations that your subordinates have for you, and the expectations that your boss and the organization have for how you're going to carry out this role. But if you think of it as a role on a stage, not that you're going to fake your way through it or anything, but creates a psychological distance to say, okay, if you step back and say, if I'm watching myself playing this role, what can I do to be most effective? And again, it helps create a little psychological distance because it's okay to be a little self-critical. Self-compassion is really important to learning this, but being able to see with a little bit of objectivity is critical as well. Find a good mentor. Find somebody, if you can hopefully find someone in the organization to talk to, that's the other key piece here. Find someone whose management or leadership you admire. See if you can sit down for a cup of coffee every so often or go to lunch or whatever, and just get some advice. If you're wrestling with how to handle a certain situation with one of your people, talk to someone you trust, because the books are great. I love it. I write a lot, so I want people to go, read things and get them from O'Reilly and elsewhere. But a lot of this is oral tradition, and it is, talking to people who've been through this and who can help coach you a bit through it. And or you can say, here's how I'm thinking of handling it, and they can tell you that's perfect, or no, here's how I would do it differently. And this is a process toward mastery, and nobody ever gets perfect. And so it is knowledge and wisdom you accumulate over years, and it just takes some time to get that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate you talking with us today.
My pleasure, Laurel. I hope it was helpful.